Okay, good afternoon, everyone. James Scullen here from the Australia-China Business Council. Many thanks for joining today's national briefing. We hope you're all doing well and staying safe during these unprecedented and uncertain times. Fortunately, we are seeing some green shoots emerge from the economic disruption in China, with now reportedly 80 to 85% of the Chinese economy has returned to work. So on today's session, we're looking to identify what this means for Australian business. And we're very proud to be partnering with our national sponsors, global accounting and advisory firm, ShineWing Australia. So today's session will be split into two halves, where at the beginning, we'll be looking at the outbound opportunities in China, and then we'll take a look at the inbound investment opportunities coming from Chinese investment. So to begin with, we'll be speaking with ShineWing Australia's managing partner, Danny Armstrong, who'll update us on China's economy, what this means for some of Australia's leading export sectors, and the suite of federal government assistance available to Australian SME exporters. We'll then cross over to Hong Kong and speak with ShineWing Australia's head of international business, David Chu, who will take a look at some of the central government stimulus measures and what this particularly means in light of the recent changes to the Foreign Investment Review Board, FIRB. So just some housekeeping before we begin. If you have a look at the bottom of your Zoom box, you will see that there's a Q&A panel just at the bottom. If you have any questions at any time during the session, please just write down in text your question. We've allocated plenty of time for Q&A, and we're looking forward to getting to everyone's questions at the second half of today's session. So please do write your questions at any time in the Q&A box. The chat feature has been disabled, so any communication through us will only be received through the Q&A box. And I'll also let you know that today's session is being recorded, so if we have any issues with the bandwidth or the feed at all, or if you'd like to pass on today's session to any of your colleagues or clients, that will be made available on the ACBC website, and it will be made available to ShineWing Australia as well. Okay, so without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to Danny Armstrong. Danny, over to you.
Thanks, James, and thanks for inviting David and I along to join you and ACBC members today. We're delighted to have the opportunity to discuss the opportunities for Australia-China business emerging from the current health and economic crisis. I might get you to just pop up the first slide if you don't mind. So this slide's just for context to show the dates that Wuhan was locked down and when the Chinese economy initially started getting back to work. On to the next slide, please, James. So firstly, to the macroeconomic picture. So over the 15-day period ending on the 15th of April, the average number of daily new COVID-19 cases in China was 52. At its peak, around 1 month earlier, there was an average of 3,860 new daily cases in China, which compares with recent US figures showing an average of 30,275 new daily cases. 91% of the new cases in China in the latest period are attributed to Chinese nationals returning from overseas. In the first quarter of 2020, retail sales declined 19% year on year in China. Industrial value added fell 8.4%, and electricity generation declined 6.8% year on year, as a result of much of the economy being in lockdown for a good proportion of the year. Across a good proportion of the quarter, I beg your pardon. Across most of China, life began slowly returning to normal in the second half of March. All of the output data I just mentioned improved significantly in the March figures. Economic activity indicators in China show that urban activities are returning to pre-outbreak levels. Traffic congestion and residential property sales are close to where they stood in early January, and air pollution and coal consumption are 75 to 85% of their levels on the 1st of January. Significantly for our discussion today, China's import growth improved by 2.4% in March, year on year, compared to being down by that level in January and February. Meat and Livestock Australia reported beef exports to China as being down 11% for March, year on year, but up 10% on February volumes. And one of our large beef producer and exporter clients confirmed to us that demand for their air freight container shipments stopped completely in late January, but started to pick up significantly in the second week of April. Chinese GDP declined 6.8% year on year in the first quarter. In mid-April, the IMF forecast that for the full 2020 year, China's GDP is expected to rise 1.2% year on year and then jump 9.2% in 2021. So a big bounce is expected. Of significance, 2019 was the 8th consecutive year that consumption and services were the major parts of China's economy, with domestic consumption accounting for 58% of GDP. This means that reduced global demand for China's exports is less of a concern than it would have been a decade ago. There are two major risks to a recovery, of course. Firstly, a resurgence in the virus, and secondly, a fear that smaller privately owned companies that drive China's growth and job creation may have difficulty surviving long enough to see their businesses recover. The central government responded quickly in China with a suite of measures to help business ease the financial burden suffered during the crisis, including rent compensation, deferred tax payments, refunds of unemployment insurance contributions, lower costs of power supply, and removing associated charges, and reduced social security contributions. The central bank has cut reserve ratios for banks and made a new credit line available to small banks to support lending to small business. A number of provincial governments have given away digital consumption coupons at a local level to stimulate consumption. The aim overall has been to quickly stimulate a return to production and consumption now that a return to normal is underway. On to the next slide, please, James. There's a degree of difficulty in answering the question about China's return to work because of China's geographic size, but I'll try to look at some of the economic indicators along with some anecdotal evidence to provide a bit of a picture. On the manufacturing front, China officially opened again on February the 10th, but practically this presented a number of difficulties as travel restrictions were still being enforced. Medical supplies were the first sector to return to full capacity because they were crucially needed, and the industry was given significant support by the central government. Other industries took a little bit longer, but overall the return of manufacturing has been pretty rapid. The return of production capacity has not been uniform, however. At the end of March, the Ministry of Commerce announced that China's exporters had resumed more than 70% of their production capacity. Of course, for many factories, the difficulty moving forward is a dramatic decrease in global demand for China's exports. An increase in the export of medical supplies will offset some of the losses, but by and large, it looks like there will continue to be a double-digit decline in export value in the second quarter. In a recent survey by China Cotton Textile Association, some member companies reported 50% order declines from the US and Europe. As I mentioned earlier, China is significantly less reliant on exports to generate economic growth than it was a decade ago, with consumption accounting for 58% of GDP last year. Over the last several years, net exports have actually contributed zero to China's GDP growth. In Shanghai and the major cities, my friends and former colleagues tell me restaurants, gyms and retail outlets are generally trading as usual, with no more reduced hours. People are back on the streets and peak hour traffic is a daily occurrence in downtown areas. They tell me that vehicle traffic is on the rise and passenger volumes on Shanghai's underground metro train system, together with street traffic, are both back to around 90% of normal volumes. The National Health Commission has downgraded health alerts, and many of the strict measures that were in place, such as temperature checks in office buildings and compounds, while certainly still in place, have been reduced in frequency. I'm told the sentiment from people who are on the ground in major cities has shifted generally to one of positivity. In Hubei province, where Wuhan is the capital, eased travel restrictions to and throughout the province were enacted at the end of March. Wuhan is officially open again, having opened public transport and actively resumed production and manufacturing. More than 95% of companies are said to have resumed operation, and about 70% of employees are back at work. The electricity generator State Grid has announced it expects power consumption in Wuhan to be at 90% of this time last year by the end of April. There were several signposts which analysts were looking to for an indication of China's progress towards recovery. They were that China's President Xi Jinping visiting Wuhan, that happened on the 10th of March. The reopening of Hubei and Wuhan, which happened earlier this month. Children going back to school. So most cities around China have been given start dates ranging through April and May. And a new date being set for China's 2 sessions political meetings, which is expected to be scheduled for some time in either May or June, according to China's Global Times. In the labour market, recruitment in middle to senior management levels saw activity rebound strongly in March as businesses adapted to remote and digital working and recommenced hiring processes that were suspended in January and February. New job vacancy rates have slowed in April, particularly amongst multinational corporations and foreign employers, as their organisations adapt to global disruptions and cost control measures. The technology sector is strong, with hiring activity among domestic players strong or greater than 2019. Pharmaceutical and medical devices and healthcare sectors are also showing resilience and stability. Online education has emerged as a hotspot of interest and activity, understandably. Personal health and wellness remain strong and also resilient as a sector. China is expected to deploy strong healthcare stimulus in lower tier cities, with a lot of commercial roles being recruited in medical services. On to the next slide, please, James. So in energy and resources, on the 11th of March, prior to Australia's lockdown, we ran an energy and resources sector luncheon in Sydney with some of our largest energy and resource clients. Their headline feedback was that volumes of their shipments of iron ore and coal to China remain largely unchanged during China's shutdown. That view is supported by discussions that I've had in the last week with trade financiers at Australian banks operating in China, and also by commodity prices. The iron ore prices remain relatively strong at around US $86 a tonne, although there's been some drop in coking coal prices in April as the China market is reopened. Data reported by Bloomberg confirms that thermal coal usage is rebounding to usage levels from 1 year ago as Chinese electricity demand gets back to normal. There has, of course, been a significant decline in the global oil price and in LNG prices as a result of shutdowns in manufacturing, air travel, and general vehicle use. A friend of mine who chairs the Global Mining Association of China observed last week that iron ore stockpiles that were built up in preparation for Chinese New Year have been largely utilised, and there will be strong pent-up demand. You would expect Chinese domestic demand for steel to support infrastructure stimulus measures to be strong, but global demand will likely remain weak for a period until the global economy gets back to some semblance of normality. In terms of consumer products, including agriculture, food and beverage, Chinese consumers are shopping again, with demand for cosmetics, skincare and food surging over the last couple of weeks because of pent-up demand. As a result of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement, and also as a result of the recent devaluation of the Aussie dollar, Australia's global competitiveness in food, beverage and agricultural commodities has improved, notably relative to New Zealand, who enacted an FTA with China some 8 years prior to us, but also relative to South America, who enjoy cheaper labour and production costs. This is providing opportunities for our Australian exporters. One of our large client groups, who have been exporting fresh produce for a number of years, are in the process of building a new distribution centre, which will increase their export capacity by a factor of 10. There's an expectation of increased demand for safe, high-quality produce from China following the COVID-19 outbreak. And we've seen that reinforced by one of our ShineWing Shanghai clients, who's a significant listed fresh produce distributor, whose chairman stated that their main goal after this pandemic is over is to significantly strengthen their international procurement and relationships with foreign suppliers. For some time, there's been heightened focus, of course, by Chinese consumers on better health and nutrition. And part of that story in food is a desire to better understand the provenance of foreign produce, source of origin, supply chain, and the story behind the product and the producer. At one of our agribusiness and food industry luncheons held last year, a senior Chinese commercial consul explained this to me as the consumer seeking not necessarily just to purchase a product in isolation from Australia, but rather seeking to purchase an aspirational lifestyle. To cater to this demand, we're seeing Australian food and beverage companies leading the way with new supply chain traceability offerings, not only to stop food fraud, but also to prove that Australian lifestyle story. Australian exporters also need to be aware of the acceleration of online shopping in China as a result of COVID-19. In future, foreign products entering the China market will need to incorporate an online strategy more than ever before. Overall, we see this as a fantastic opportunity, both for our political leaders to build a stronger relationship and more of a bilateral partnership with China for mutual benefit of our two countries and our peoples. On to the next slide, please, James. So on the subject of Australian government stimulus, there's been 3 specific measures announced for exporters to date. As part of the stimulus, the government has provided increased export market development grant funding and relaxed rules to assist SME exporters in respect of the current financial year. Broadly, these grants provide exporters with turnover under $50 million with funding to sustain and grow their export activities. The grant essentially reimburses up to 50% of eligible expenditure, up to a maximum of $150,000. An additional $50 million has been made available for this financial year. Some of the opportunities and implications are some exporters who've previously been ineligible may become eligible for these grants if their turnover now falls below the $50 million threshold. More exporters should also receive the full $150,000 grant because the total available funding has increased, raising the ceiling available for individual grant payments. We'd encourage any businesses that are considering claiming the export market development grants for this financial year to act quickly. First in, best dressed. Claims can be made from the 1st of July 2020. As part of the COVID-19 stimulus package, the government has allocated $110 million in air freight support for agriculture, fisheries and forestry industry participants to help exporters get their high quality produce into key overseas markets. The program aims to address the practical reality that air freight has been significantly constrained in both capacity and cost during this time, meaning that many exporters have been unable to get their high value produce, and products to market, or have only been able to do so at a cost premium. The focus of the support is predominantly for perishable products, where Australian exporters have important established customers in markets and will initially focus on the key markets of China, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore and the UAE. The Australian government has also established a $500 million COVID-19 export capital facility to assist previously profitable Australian exporters whose businesses have been impacted by COVID-19. SME exporters will be able to access loans from $250,000 to $50 million under the export facility, which will complement other measures announced by the government to enable banks to support new and existing clients. The scheme will be administered by Export Finance Australia. Exporters should contact their banks in the first instance to determine what assistance may be available to them. Separately, I'm aware that the Queensland and New South Wales state governments had issued stimulus packages in their states for exporters, which we're happy to assist you talk about offline. I'll now hand you over to David, who will talk about the investment landscape. David.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, James. We follow through with a little bit of understanding of what China government has done in the process of resumption of a business for Chinese companies. Since a resumption in February, the Chinese government have, like what they have done before, always provide directives to various government departments, and also as to how to allocate resources. And then government departments will also then filter it down to individual provinces and cities to implement all those directions or packages. Now, the central government, importantly at this stage, is to allocate resources to virus protection and prevention. Obviously, this is for health and safety of the population. But at the same time, we need to feed the 1.4 billion population. So logistics is important, while at the same time, not only about quantity and quality as well. So quality control is also important. Then to the local government level, when they implement all these sort of mechanisms or packages, they would suggest all the governments in municipals and also in the city governments to especially focus in assistance to SMEs, including what we call the micro businesses. And then there are also relief measures on tax deferrals and also government charges. Again, SMEs will be hit hardest during the COVID-19 sort of restrictions period. So it is important that provision of credit to SME is important. Say, like, for example, just to give a few examples, like we talk about logistics. At the moment, all highways in China are free, so this will reduce the cost of procurement or procuring the product. So until end of June, all highways are actually free of charge. Then priority will be also given to agricultural produce to be supplied to the urban areas. In terms of the Ministry of Education, they also included in their directives are provision of free online training to employees, knowing that a lot of employees are still not able to get to work. James, can I have the next slide, please? Now, one of those ministries which are more, I would say, important to us doing business with China will be the Ministry of Commerce. What their directive will be to ensure that, again, it is about health and safety. Secondly, it's about daily necessities. They specifically mention 8 products the supply of which is as important or essential. That include all the vegetables, meat, dairy, and wheat, flour, edible oil, and convenient food. Again, in terms of location, they specifically mention Beijing, Shanghai, Guangdong, Henan, Zhejiang province, and Anhui province and Jiangxi province. And in terms of sort of macro directions, they also, it's important that the domestic trade, foreign trade, and then they also have to look after foreign enterprises who are actually operating in China. For foreign trade, like Danny has mentioned, the logistics is important. Australian government have air freight subsidy. Again, Chinese government also provide emphasis on supply chain to it. And also they have to look after all those anchor businesses in various industry sectors. Again, they promote resources to support online business, and then develop, even they have a new business development, new business models to cater for the situations after the COVID-19. Again, if there is any technology or processes which can reduce double handling and also cross-contamination of products or produce, again, that would be encouraged. Yes, James, can I have the next slide? Now, as to China, As to what happened with China since the resumption, Reuters conduct a survey back in February 17, which covered 20 businesses in China, employing 400,000 staff. And they include businesses in restaurant, retail, manufacturing, trading, pharmaceutical, consulting services, logistics, internet or online trading, finance, and also traveling. Now, at that point in time, over 80% of the business in China has already resumed operations in certain form, and 58% actually have resumed 80% of operations. Only 23% at that point in time cannot confirm when resumption will happen. Next slide, please. At that point in time, 65% of all businesses surveyed, they adopt certain form of work from home and flexi hours. Now, flexi hours is also important at that time because they avoid people traveling during the peak hours, which could compromise the overall health situation in China. Now, major challenges encountered by the manufacturing business will be the self-isolation requirement because workers cannot come to work. And also there were shortages of parts and components. Also at that point in time, they also have difficulties in sourcing protective gears and as well as facial mask sanitizers. James, can I have the next one? But then back last week, the Ministry of Industries and Information Technology came up with a report. The report was that 80% of SMEs have already resumed operation, and further measures would have relief measures would have to be implemented by the government to assist SMEs. Also, there will be more emphasis on collection of receivables, also addressing the cash flow issues of SMEs. A report today from a prominent asset management company or corporate advisory company called CICC came out, and the result is that 89% of all businesses in China have already resumed operation. Largely, 100% of the listed companies already resumed operation, and a lot of the smaller ones are still in the process. Can I have the next slide, please, James? For China, the numbers are actually compiled from a whole heaps of indicators. Lately, the indicators would include, obviously, will be incorporated in the big data and incorporate something, virtually 140 items. That include coal consumption, as Danny has mentioned, passenger volumes like air, road traffic, rail, and retail. Parcel deliveries, internet usage, as well as electricity consumption. Now, this slide is actually I copied from the Shanghai government as to an indication of how business have traveled, and this was produced last week. There are 5 sectors in this slide. The first on the left is commercial building. Second from the left is hotel and restaurants. The middle one is shopping centers. Second from the right is medical and health, as well as the further right is the government departments. What we have to look at is the 2 bars. One is in each of sectors, you got the light blue, which is the week before Chinese New Year holiday, and the dark blue, which was last week. So you can see that in each of the sectors, they are all down before the Chinese New Year. However, they are all trending up, as most of us might have experienced. So in general, about 89–90% of the Chinese businesses, and this chart is about electricity consumption in Shanghai. So largely in China, about 89–90% of the businesses have already resumed operation. Next slide, please, James. So the reason why I use those slides is to provide all our guests here as an overall situation in China. That means China at the moment is more focused in getting the domestic economy going in terms of production, in terms of food supply, in terms of the safety of the population, as well as the cash flow and issues of all businesses. That doesn't mean that they have forgotten about foreign investment or foreign trade. It is still in the plan, but the government's directive is look after all those foreign enterprises who are already operating in China first, to make sure that they are running equally smoothly as resume operations smoothly as other Chinese businesses. In terms of foreign trade, make sure that the logistics and quality issues are being addressed. That means foreign investment overseas might be put not being put at the first priority. That doesn't mean that they are not looking at it. Last week we spoke to some of our contacts in China. Although it has been the momentum has stalled a little bit. However, there are two areas which the Chinese government would still, or Chinese companies would still be interested in considering. One is investments in renewables. The others is investment in agribusiness in Australia. So if there are opportunities in those areas, there is obviously an opportunity which might be able to be work on. However, interestingly, last week when I spoke to a lot of our contacts in China, this issue pop up, which is the what you call the anti-Chinese sentiment in overseas. Now that is not only about Australia, it's about overseas. This is probably more important for privately owned enterprises in China investing overseas. Apparently, we can't control it. It's reported in the media. Whether it has been exaggerated or what, it's up to the readers to assess. However, if for Australia to continue attracting investment from China, this is one of the issues that we need to address to alleviate the concern. And also another issue that popped up last week was about the FIRB changes in approval. The week before, the FIRB have actually changed the rules in that they reduce the threshold for approval to 0. That means any businesses in any investment that needs require FIRB approval virtually have to be vetted by FIRB, and also they extend the vetting period from 3 months to 6 months. That has become a little bit of a concern to privately owned enterprises who like to invest in China. However, that doesn't mean that Australia is not open for business, because the rule, first of all, the rule applies to all companies, all nations in the world who like to invest in Australia. Secondly, all those businesses all those investments which do not require FIRB approval can still be proceeded, such as if you invest less than 5% in media, invest less than 10% in agriculture, invest 20% in any non-land rich businesses, you still can go ahead. However, if anything over and above those which originally require approval, if it's not beyond certain amount, then you might have to wait. There's a likelihood that you have to wait 6 months. However, FIRB retain a fair bit of flexibility in that. They would also consider it on case-by-case basis. Now, what does that mean for investment and trade opportunities? In the next slide, I would like to summarize some of the opportunities which we identify for Australia and China, which bilateral investment and trade. One is single-use food containers. The photo here was taken about 2 weeks ago in a food outlet in Hong Kong. As Danny have alluded to, online food purchase has increased, not only in China, but also in Hong Kong. A lot of our contacts in Hong Kong who haven't actually ordered food online or cooked food online previously, now they're actually used to it. But in order to deliver the food, you need containers. And at the moment, a fair bit of the containers are still in plastic or polystyrene, now, which is not environmental friendly. If Australia, we are known for health, we are known for clean and green. So if there are technologies in Australia who might address this sort of a food container, single-use food containers challenge, there will be opportunities. Secondly, because of the COVID-19 situation, more online purchase have occurred in China and also in Hong Kong and overseas. So that actually present Australian companies whose products have an opportunity in China to utilize online marketing, the business model, to market their products in China. Bear in mind, in China, there are close to something like 1.3 billion mobile phones in China. So buying from China, buying a product online becomes a habit in China. However, in order to tap onto the opportunity, the Australian businesses obviously still have to address the issues of selection of the platform. They have to look at the algorithm the platform is using in order to promote the products. Second is also the selection of KOLs, what we call key opinion leaders. Lately, there's been a change in the KOLs. If the KOLs are representing a company, the audience virtually turn off. But if the KOL is representing himself, actually that got a lot of followings, and the followings are in the number of, say, like 10 million, 30 million. So this is an opportunity for Australian businesses if they can address those issues, and obviously the normal business issues like logistics and also inventories, customer service are also important. Fourthly, there are opportunities in the Greater Bay Area. Now, Greater Bay Area development has been a focus in the last 2 years, and lately there have been less focus in it because of the COVID-19 situation. But it is still there. It got a population of 70 million, and that provides Australian businesses, especially SMEs, with a potential market. Renewable and agriculture, I have mentioned before. And again, the overarching favorable situation is that Danny also mentioned about this, is the favorable exchange rate would allow Australia investing Australian assets or company to be less expensive, and also making exports more attractive. And on that note, I might sort of stop here with my presentation and invite our audience or participant to give us more any sort of clarifications or any questions. Back to you, James.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. And thanks, Danny, for such a comprehensive, overarching presentation from both of you. Now, just before we go to the questions, I just have a poll for the attendees. So you'll see on your screen now, I've just launched a poll. We're just asking for general business sentiment about the Australia-China business environment. So I'll check back in with the results of that survey in about 10 minutes after we go through some questions. So the first question I have, David, this is probably best geared towards yourself. It's from Toby. Will we see the same kind of economic stimulus from the central government that we saw back in 2008 in response to the GFC? Or maybe you could just help to outline what's been different this time around from the central government in its stimulus?
In terms of the level of stimulus, the package is virtually twice, if not 3 times, more than the 2008. Secondly, 2008 primarily affect the financial sector, but this time, when 90% of the world's population are actually have to work behind borders, and also something like 60% of the world's population are also staying at home. Now that means that affect the entire supply chain, affect the entire global trade. So this time the government the central government put a lot of effort in not only safety of the population, but also, as I mentioned earlier, provide liquidity in the market as to provision of employment, retention of business, and recovering, and at the same time is encouragement of new business model and innovation.
Can I add something there, James? I think you're probably also going to see, while infrastructure in the traditional sense will still be important, I think you're also going to see more stimulus for new infrastructure. So high-tech infrastructure, 5G base stations, big data communication centres, charging stations for new energy vehicles, etc. And I think you're probably going to see stimulus, as I mentioned in my presentation, for healthcare, particularly in lower tier cities where people have been relatively disadvantaged.
David, could I just follow on from that? So with regards to overseas direct investment, and you did mention that perhaps overseas investment won't be the priority at the moment as the domestic economy needs to get recharged. We've seen in Australia in the past the way the central government can control capital flows into countries like Australia through the sectors where money's being invested. What levers does the central government have to maybe regulate overseas investment, if there were any indications of how that may affect overseas investment going into Australia? Would there be any indicators or levers that the central government could pull that would see the central government slowing down overseas direct investment at all?
Well, in the information I receive, there is no indication that the foreign investment will be sort of reduced. But having said that, the policy has always been there. As long there are areas where the sectors where will be more beneficial or conducive to the Chinese development of the Chinese economy, will obviously be receive favorable treatment. As I mentioned earlier, high technology, renewables, agri-produce, so those will continue to be looked at. The issue at the moment is because every government, from the central government to the municipal in China, they are putting their focus in making sure that the population is safe, they are being fed properly, and also the logistics and quality are all being addressed. So there are limited resources to devote to overseas investment at the moment. That doesn't mean that it won't happen. It's just that the resources are more dedicated to ensure that the domestic situations are being addressed.
Okay. I have a few questions here with regards to logistics, particularly logistics of non-essential products. Someone writes, my company exports beauty products to China, and I'm worried about the access to domestic transport. What will happen to transport of non-necessity products in China?
I think it's natural to assume that the essential sectors of the economy will get the first attention, particularly in areas like healthcare, food, basic day-to-day needs of people. But progressively, as China gets back to work, and we're told that that's now at 70 to 80%, maybe even higher, then I think you'll see full logistic chains get back and operational again. As to timing, that might still take a little while, but I'd expect it to flow through not too far down the track. Not sure if David's got anything to add to that.
Yes, I actually spoke to an operator in logistics in Hong Kong who actually handle a lot of traffic between Australia and China via Hong Kong or direct. What he experienced lately is that the air freight, the cost of air freight has actually doubled or if not tripled in the last couple of months because of the fact that there are actually less flights between Australia and China. So naturally, the freight charges will be higher. As to then you look at whether from a commercial point of view, whether it is economically viable to send the stuff to China or send the stuff back from China using air freight. Now that is obviously a commercial decision. Secondly, is that when you get to China, when we need local transportation, what I notice is that every port have their own priorities. But having said that, the overarching one is essentials and healthcare. So that would receive, if you need to allocate resources, those will receive priority.
We have another question. Given many businesses are back up and running, workers are back and people are on the streets, what measures have been put in place to maintain safety of the population and control the virus? Danny, I know you made mention of temperature screening at office buildings. I was just wondering if you maybe had anything more to add about how the government was monitoring the health situation as China gets back to work.
Sure, James. And I've also cheated by WeChatting Toby in Shanghai live. So he's told me that masks were mandatory, but about 2 weeks ago, new guidelines were stated that if you're outdoors and in ventilated spaces and not in a group, you're okay to dispense with the mask. There's still temperature checks to get into complexes, buildings, offices, shops and restaurants. Many places have set up checkpoints with automatic temperature checks. And of course, if you fail those checks, then you'll have to, go away for more detailed checks, I guess. There's still distancing rules in restaurants for seating. And you must display an app to get into an office or certain buildings or when you travel to show that your health is in good order. So there's a variety of measures still in place that the government's been put in place some time ago that will, I guess, take some time to be relaxed fully to ensure the safety of the population as best they can.
We have another question coming in from Claire. These days, the potential M&A of Virgin Airlines from Chinese airline companies has been covered in the media. So I think it's a question about Virgin Airlines Australia and potential M&A activity from Chinese airline companies. I guess, David, just maybe getting an opinion on, do you think that Virgin Airlines is something that Chinese air companies are looking towards in terms of an investment?
Well, obviously, Chinese companies are obviously will be interested in any opportunities overseas. From the media, we learned that Virgin Australia is looking for sort of investors. I would not be surprised if some Chinese airlines will be interested. That's one. But Whether this is, obviously you have to go through the process. One, it has to be commercially viable. Two is that whether that would fall into the basket of national security. Now, that is something for the financial advisors to navigate. But given our experience in the past, working on billions of dollars of projects, is that for aviation and for agriculture and all these sort of, I call it sensitive, a bit of sensitive sectors, it would be worthwhile for China, even if the Chinese airlines are interested, it would be worthwhile for them to consider collaboration with some local businesses for many reasons. So yeah, from where I read, it's not surprising, but it has to be sort of approached properly.
David, I think another question for you. Someone asks, why Greater Bay Area? Aren't all areas of China seeking foreign investment and offering similar incentives? And I guess just following on from that, I guess the question's asking, do you see there being greater incentivization of the Greater Bay Area?
Yeah, as you mentioned rightly, all areas in China, cities, provinces, they do have the incentive package. But this is to address the immediate challenges of getting back to work and also address the issues of liquidity. The Greater Bay Area provides Australian businesses with what I call medium-term opportunities, in the sense that Greater Bay Area is got a population of 70 million people, 3 times of that of Australia. Going through the Greater Bay Area, the 9 plus 2, 11, that is 11 cities, needs only 3 days going through the 11 cities. It has a GDP of 1.5 trillion US dollars, which is pretty much the same as Australia. So knowing that Australia is a lot of companies in Australia are all SMEs. Now, it would be a bit beyond their reach if they market their products or services in China, because it's huge. The geographical coverage is huge. But for the Greater Bay Area, with a population 3 times as much as Australia, it probably is an economic area or zone whereby Australia is palatable to a typical Australian small and medium-sized business. So instead of looking after, if you've got niche products or services, instead of only looking after a population of 25 million, now you have the opportunity to look after a population of 70 million, and also it's less expensive and viable as well.
So we might just have time for one more question as we come up to 4 o'clock. This question's from Lily, and I'll just put this to both of you. It sounds promising that China has started their economy again. What has the central government thought in relation to a resurgence of COVID-19 and the risk of reinfection? And what confidence have you in relation to the numbers?
Wow. Well, I think the media has certainly reflected that the government has been most concerned around, I can't remember the exact terminology, but reintroduced cases coming back into the country from overseas, probably over the course of the last month in particular, hence why the border was shut to foreigners. So I think that's their primary focus, and those measures that I mentioned earlier are still in place to ensure that, I guess, that if there is any outbreak, that they can nip it in the bud. And they've got all those checks and balances going on to ensure that if people have a high temperature, for example, or other risk factors, that they can identify that quickly and isolate people to make sure that they don't spread the disease. In terms of confidence in the numbers, I think China's been at pains from day one to talk about how transparent it was being, how open it was to foreign experts coming and assisting, and ensuring that it provided full and frank data. So I know there's been some different stories playing out in the Australian and global media, but I think all we can do is rely on the information that is being provided from the health authorities in China. I have no reason to question them.
And I guess, you know, like we could also just look at the actual response of the government in so many people being out in public spaces and being given the confidence to resume back to daily life. I mean, I wouldn't assume the government would do so if they, you know, had a different data set that it was withholding from the public.
I think that's a very good point. And they wouldn't be setting dates for schools to go back. And I think Zhejiang has already got schools back, maybe from this week. So I don't think that would be happening in China if the government thought there was a really significant risk.
Yeah, and the latest number about the on the COVID-19 is that on latest number on last weekend was new cases is only 16, and 7 of those are local and 9 are actually being introduced from overseas. So it looks like it's being under control. Now the issue at the moment with the challenge is for to actually detect those who haven't got any symptoms. That is the challenge at the moment.
Okay, well, Danny and David, thank you so much for giving such a thorough update today. There's obviously so much to talk about, so many sectors, so many ways the Australian and Chinese government and economies are intertwined and engaged. So look forward to catching up with you again, and we should do a session like this in the coming months. Now, let me just check the results of our poll, which I will share right now. Okay, so not too bad. So we have 44% being confident about the future period of the Australia-China business environment, with 28% being cautious. So I'd say I'm happy to take that as a positive sentiment going forward. Now, just before we finish today's meeting, I'd just like to share with you some of ACBC's upcoming activities. You would have seen this on the slide when you entered today's event. So ACBC, we conduct hundreds of events across the country year round. Obviously, COVID-19 has constrained our ability to do that. But we continue on with a whole suite of digital events that's available mostly free to our members. If we have a look at what's coming up this week, tomorrow we have an event on how to create webinars worth watching. We have an event on technology opportunities in China on the 22nd. I'll be hosting a national briefing on COVID-19 and e-commerce on Wednesday. I'm really looking forward to that. As we've talked about today, you know, e-commerce has really picked up. Different demographics of Chinese people have taken up e-commerce for the first time. So there's really a lot to talk about in that space. On the 23rd, the Victorian branch has an event on communicating through challenging times. And next week, I've got a really exciting event coming up with John Daly from the Grattan Institute and Rowan Calick, where we'll be having a look at the big picture of the bilateral relationship between Australia and China. So definitely plenty of things to look forward to going forward. So thanks a lot, Danny and David and ShineWing. We really appreciate your support as being one of our national sponsors. Thanks a lot for everyone attending today's session. Stay safe, and we look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.